You find yourself wandering through the soft-filtered forests of ancient Mount. Nisa, the ground beneath your feet is mossy and sweet-smelling, and above, thick canopies of vines stretch like tangled chandeliers. Everything is drowsy and green, and humming with the slow, sticky magic of half-remembered myths. There are no wars here, no divine punishments or thunderbolts. Just satyrs napping under fig trees and nymphs adjusting dew on flower petals. This, according to sleepy legend, was where Dionysus spent the longest and most forgettable part of his youth. Far from Olympus and its politics, he grew up in the company of rustic, woodland-being satyrs with flutes, ivy-haired nymphs, and the occasional elderly goat who claimed to remember when trees were shorter. You may know Dionysus as the god of wine, revelry, and chaotic theater. But before he became a deity of festivals and frenzies, he was a child with odd hobbies chief among them. Writing letters to trees. This is not the part of the myth you usually hear. Most sources skip over it because, frankly, it doesn't go anywhere. There are no battles or dramatic betrayals. Just a divine toddler who took it upon himself to correspond quite formally with local vegetation. At first, it was olive trees, then junipers. Eventually, he developed a strange fondness for a particular fig tree that stood near a trickling stream. Its bark, oddly smooth and slightly curved, as if at once leaned over to drink and never stood back up. Dionysus was still learning his alphabet then. His tutor was an elderly satyr named Nicholas, who smelled like fermented plums and insisted that every letter must be sung before it was written. Lessons were erratic and often interrupted by nap breaks, snack breaks, or philosophical arguments about the nature of goat cheese. One afternoon, after copying the Greek letter eta 6 times in berry juice, Dionysus sat down beneath the fig tree and carefully scratched out a message on a thin strip of bark. The note read something like, "To the fig tree by the stream, thank you for the shade. I would like to be friends." Dionysus, age 7, god in training, he tied it to one of the branches using a vine ribbon and waited. He waited for several days. The fig tree said nothing, not even a rustle that might be interpreted as a whisper. But that didn't bother him. If anything, the silence made the tree seem more dignified. So he continued writing. Every few days, a new letter would appear. Some asked questions. Do you like when it rains? Others offered compliments. Your leaves are very good at being leaves. A few were more speculative. If a nymph fell in love with a mushroom, what would their house look like? There is no evidence that the tree ever replied. No leaf trembled unknowingly. No bark shimmered with runes. No figs arranged themselves into cryptic patterns. But the godling was unbothered. He simply assumed that fig trees were Cheyenne. Perhaps. Very slow readers, it is important to note that this period of mythic Greek history was not governed by urgency. Time, like syrup, moved slowly. Dionysus had no battles to fight, no temples to fill with incense. His days consisted mostly of learning the alphabet, practicing flute badly, and sleeping in the sun with a wreath of twigs on his head. The fig tree became his confidant, albeit a silent one. He told it about the strange visions he sometimes had of grapes bursting open on their own, of theater masks crying without actors, of cities that hadn't been built yet but already smelled of wine. These dreams confused him. The satyrs shrugged and said it was probably the cheese dot in one particularly long letter. Dionysus confessed his dislike of formality. The other gods want robes and sacrifices. I just want naps and warm things and stories about leaves. Again, the tree remained silent. It dropped a fig, but that may have been unrelated. Now, you may be wondering, why did this matter? Why record such a sleepy correspondence between a half-divine boy and a silent tree? Well, a few dusty scrolls from minor mythographers, mostly the kind who scribbled things in the margins of larger, more heroic epics note that during this era, Dionysus began shaping his identity, not through battle or conquest, but through slowness, through waiting, through letters with no reply. He learned that not everything spoke back, that some things, trees, rivers, silence itself had their own kind of language, one that required patience. This, the scrolls suggest, may have been the origin of his later tolerance for chaos and contradiction. He didn't mind when things didn't make sense. He had spent years riding to a fig tree. Meanwhile, the satyrs began to take notice. They started calling the tree the wise one and left tiny offerings of wine cups and garlands at its roots. Some claimed it had blinked. Others said it whispered at midnight. It hadn't. But no one wanted to correct them. Over time, the letters became stranger, more poetic. Less about facts, more about feelings. He once wrote, "Do you ever miss things you've never seen? I think I remember a party I haven't had yet." Scholars debate whether this was an early sign of his prophetic gift or just a product of poor napping habits. Eventually, the godling grew older. His letters slowed. One day, he left a final note. "Thank you. I have to go now, but I'll come back, probably as a cloud." He didn't explain what that meant. The tree, as always, offered no commentary, and so Dionysus left Mount Nysa to begin the winding journey that would take him through lands, legends, and libations. But the fig tree remained. Some say it lived for centuries. Others claim it fell into the stream one winter, and its roots still hum with forgotten messages. Of course, there's no archaeological evidence for any of this. Fig trees do not keep archives. Satyrs rarely file paperwork. But somewhere among the vines and moss, there may still be a soft whisper of berry-stained bark and a child god's handwriting, slowly fading under layers of time, and it makes one wonder. As Dionysus left Mount Nysa and stepped into the wide, unpredictable theater of mythic Greece, he carried little with him, just a staff wrapped in ivy, a faint smell of sun-dried figs, and the quiet habit of speaking to things that did not answer. This was not unusual for the time. The ancient world was filled with objects believed to possess vague personalities. Wells that sighed, stones that remembered things, and trees that listened more attentively than most mortals. But Dionysus went a step further. He didn't just believe trees were listening. He acted as if they were the only ones worth talking to. As he wandered from region to region, people began to whisper about him, not as a conquering god, but as a wandering one, a soft-spoken deity with a strange fondness for shade and naps. He did not raise temples with thunder or carve his face into mountains. He preferred vineyards, hidden groves, and long conversations. With moss-covered rocks in Phrygia, he was offered a golden cup. He declined, asking instead for a place to rest. When pressed, he gave a single instruction: build me a bench under a fig tree. The rest will happen. And so it did. That bench, never completed by the Wabi, came a kind of myth in itself. Pilgrims claimed that God would sometimes reappear and fall asleep there, talking in his dreams to invisible plants. His followers were an odd bunch: former shepherds, half-awake philosophers, wandering potters, and a few unusually expressive donkeys. They didn't build altars, they mostly built shade. Vine-laced pergolas, low awnings made of woven reeds, and hammocks strung between olive trees. Sleep became a kind of worship. You, walking through this history, might imagine that it all felt less like a cult and more like a nap-friendly book club. There were teachings, though, not sermons or commandments. Naisis wasn't that sort of God, but gentle observations muttered in passing. Things like, wait before judging. Some figs ripen late. Listen to the rock. It has nothing to say, but says it calmly. The sky does not ask to be seen. Some of these sayings were passed down. Others were written on scraps of bark, tucked into shoes, or lost entirely. His followers, called the faint ones by critics, were known to fall asleep mid-ritual. One legend claims that Dionysus once delivered a 2-hour lecture to a group of sleeping goats and felt it is his best audience yet, but not everyone approved. Other gods, particularly those who liked to be taken serious, Lathina with her logic, Apollo with his structure, grew mildly irritated. They did not understand how this sleepy vine god was gathering a reputation without conquering anything, and more confusing still, he didn't seem to care. Hermes once approached him during a spring festival, sandals dusted from some mercantile errand, and asked, somewhat puzzled, "Don't you want people to understand you?" Dionysus, lying on a rug of time, replied, "Why? The fig tree never did." Hermes didn't follow, but he didn't press the matter. The gods had all accepted, grudgingly, that Dionysus didn't play by their rules. This is where the story folds. Back toward that original fig tree, years after he had left Mount Nysa, Dionysus found himself wandering through a dusty island in the Aegean. It was mostly hills and stubborn goats. He came upon a small village where the people were too tired to celebrate anything. Drought had thinned their crops. Even the temple columns looked like they wanted to sit down. Dionysus asked, as he often did, "Is there a tree I can talk to?" They showed him an old fig tree near a forgotten spring. It was bent and brittle, no shade of fruit, just bark and memory. He sat beside it anyway. Over the next few weeks, he began writing again. Little notes, half-formed ideas, short poems that ended without conclusion. He tied them to the tree using long, wiry grasses. No one read them. One replied. The villagers thought him mad. One of them asked why he wasted ink on silence. He replied, "Because sometimes silence tells you where you are." It became a ritual. Write a note, tie it to the tree, sleep. Over and over, children came to watch. Some copied him, others mocked him. One brave girl asked if she could write something too. He gave her a leaf to write on and smiled without explaining why. These things never made it into the major epics. Homer didn't mention them. Hesiod had other concerns. But here, in the space between gods and mortals, something gentle was unfolding. The fig tree began to bloom again, slowly, quietly, as if the letters had warmed it from within. The first fig was small and oddly shaped. The villagers weren't sure if it was edible. Dionysus didn't eat it either. He placed it in a clay bowl and left it under the tree, a kind of offering to whatever strange, delayed conversation was. Finally unfolding, from that day he began referring to the tree not as the fig tree, but simply as my friend. When asked what he meant, he shrugged. Friendship doesn't require understanding, just listening. The fig tree taught me that. This is often referred to by obscure scholars as the fig correspondence period, is where Dionysus's philosophy truly emerged. It had no name. It wasn't written down, but its principles were known to those who slowed down enough to feel them. All things are slower than they appear. Joy is patient. Even gods must wait for ripening. Oddly enough, this became deeply popular with shepherds and olive growers, not because it promised miracles, but because it required almost nothing, only stillness, time, and a willingness to sit under a tree and ask, "How are you today?" knowing you'd get no answer, and somewhere in the background, the original fig tree on Mount Nysa stood as it always had, silent, probably unbothered, possibly asleep, its letters long faded, its purpose uncertain, but Dionysus never forgot in later years, when he was worshipped in city-states and drunken festivals, when his name was invoked in theaters and vineyards across the Mediterranean. He would sometimes vanish for days. His followers assumed he was off, causing divine mischief. But some believe, some quiet, gentle believers, that he simply returned to the fig tree to sit, to write, to not be answered, and it makes one wonder. Years later, long after the goats had stopped gossiping, long after the ink-stained leaves had crumbled into soil, and long after the fig tree had been woven into 1,000 half-remembered myths, Dionysus found himself in a city. This was not unusual. By this time, he was widely worshipped. His name echoed in temples and taverns alike. His festivals were sprawling, joyful, and loud to loud, some whispered. Women danced in hills under moonlight. Actors wore masks and told stories that twisted reality like grapevines around marble pillars. People laughed, wept, drank, and forgot themselves. It was everything a god of revelry could ask for, and yet he was strangely quiet during the performances. He would watch the plays unfold, tragedies of kings, comedies of fools, dramas of mistaken identity, remained still even as the audience erupted in laughter or gasps. Those seated near him often noted that he seemed distracted, not bored exactly, just ... elsewhere. They didn't know that he was thinking about the fig tree, not a specific one necessarily. By now, there were many fig trees in his life, many groves where letters had been left, many branches that had held his thoughts, but all of them had blended into one in his memoria singular. Unresponsive friend. He missed that silence. In the city, everything talked back. Questions sparked debates. Ideas spawned movements. Even his smallest mutterings were seized upon by poets and priests and turned into doctrines. It was exhausting, so he began retreating, sometimes physically, other times only inwardly. Even at the grandest festivals, surrounded by tambourines and wild dancers, he would disappear for hours, finding quiet corners where vines grew stubborn through stone and a little shade could be found. There, he would sit and hum to himself. And occasionally, if no one was watching, he would write a letter. They were different, now shorter, simpler. He no longer expected replies. That part had ended long ago, but the ritual remained right. Tied to something that wouldn't respond and walk away. He wrote to a cracked amphora once, to a mossy statue missing its head, to a loaf of bread that had gone stale in the sun. But more often than not, he returned to the fig tree, not the original tree on Mount Nysa, which may have withered or gone entirely to myth by now. Instead, he found other fig trees, quiet ones, solitary ones that stood alone at the edge of fields, as if waiting for a conversation that had yet to begin. In Athens, during one particularly warm spring, he discovered a fig tree near the back of a disused theater. It was young and unimpressive, thin trunk, shy leaves, no fruit. But it stood near a cracked marble column where no one else ever walked. He decided it would do. Over the following months, he returned to it often. Not every day, not even regularly, but often enough that the bark began to show the faint lines of where vine string had once been tied. He wrote small things. The play today made people cry. I liked the part with the dog. Someone sang a song with my name in it. Didn't. Rhyme. That was nice. A man asked me what ecstasy means. I said, a very slow nap. Still, no replies, which was, of course, the point. One day, late in the season, he tied what would be his final letter to that particular fig tree. The note read, I think I understand now. You were never ignoring me. You were showing me how to listen. The next morning, a single fig had appeared, just one, perfectly shaped, still firm, slightly golden at the tip. He didn't eat it. He left it there and went to the theater, where that night's performance, a comedy about a donkey who becomes a philosopher, would make the audience roar with sleepy laughter. He laughed too, softly. But later, as the theater emptied and the stars began to peel themselves across the sky like old wallpaper, he walked back to the fig tree. The fig was still there. He took it in his hands, turned it over once, and placed it in the folds of his robe. Some say he gave it to a boy who reminded him of himself. Others say he planted its seeds in Mount Nysa again. And a few say he simply carried it with him, always, a quiet weight in his pocket to remind him of things. Unsaid dot. And so the myth drifted into silence, not with a bang, but a pause. Not with an ending, but a softness. Historians rarely mention this part. There's too little drama, too few gods fighting, no monsters slain, no great cities built or destroyed, just a fig tree, and a God who never stopped listening to it. But if you find yourself, one day, standing beneath a fig tree with nothing, much to say, you might try writing something down. Something small, something sincere. Tie it to the branch with a ribbon or a shoelace. Wait, don't expect an answer, but listen anyway, because the fig tree remembers, and it makes one wonder. You find yourself in the quiet corridors of a Roman temple, just before dawn. The air is heavy with incense. The scent of ash and laurel hangs in long, unmoving curtains. And somewhere, deep inside the marble halls, a pot of something suspiciously bland is being stirred with ceremonial focus. This is not a temple you'll find on most tourist routes. Not the grand Capitoline shrines or the magnificent Pantheon with its cosmic oculus. No, this temple is far smaller, located in a corner of the Aventine Hill, tucked between two shrubberies and the crumbling remains of an earlier shrine to a forgotten river spirit. It was dedicated to Fulgora, the Roman goddess of lightning god. Minor deity, technically, but one who had managed to maintain a small but devout following due to her unpredictable temper and fondness for atmospheric drama. The priests here were quiet men, not stoic in the heroic sense, but more ... cautious, thoughtful. The kind of men who spent long hours rearranging scrolls and whispering about cloud formations. They wore robes that never quite fit and sandals that squeaked slightly with every reverent step. They were responsible for observing omens in the sky. They did not shout their prophecies. They simply noted things. Scribbled observations like 3 thunderclaps before noon equals cancel vegetable offerings. Mist before the chorus of crows equals proceed with caution, but continue lentils. 2 blue sparks and a sneeze equals consult the thunder scroll. Among the many rituals and customs observed by these priests, one stood out for its peculiar specificity. No chickpeas before a storm. It was written not loudly, not dramatically, but in the margins of an old kitchen inventory scroll. In the case of rumbling skies, abstain from Satyr ariatinum. Digestive disharmony brings divine confusion. Satyr ariatinum, of course, is the humble chickpea. You might know it today as the main ingredient in hummus or as a pleasant addition to salads. But in this sleepy corner of Rome, it had become a source of holy caution, and so began the curious tradition of storm fasting. It started simply. One priest, an observant man named Lucius Minor, had a particularly difficult afternoon after consuming a heavy chickpea stew, and then witnessing a bolt of lightning strike the temple's sundial. He didn't interpret this as divine punishment. Lucius was a rational man, but he did note that his stomach had made thunder-like gurgling noises moments before the bolt. Out of respect, he fasted from chickpeas the next day. Another priest, Servius, tried to prove the superstition false by eating a full bowl of roasted chickpeas during an approaching storm. He was promptly startled by a loud crack of thunder that caused him to drop the entire bowl. He slipped, twisted his ankle slightly, and muttered something about divine indigestion. The tradition stuck now. It's important to understand that Roman priests, especially those devoted to lesser-known deities, had a lot of time on their hands. The major gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, got all the big festivals and public holidays, but the priests of Fulgora were mostly left with small, midweek observations and a few lightning-related prayers that had to be chanted very slowly in Latin while standing on alternating tiles. So, naturally, they wrote everything. Down dot, there are entire scrolls devoted to acceptable foods during barometric instability. Chickpeas, absolutely not, especially when roasted with garlic. Why garlic mattered is unclear, but several footnotes suggest that the priests believed it confused the lightning. Visitors to the temple were sometimes baffled. A young senator, hoping to show off his religious devotion, once arrived with a large donation of chickpea cakes for the goddess. The head priest politely accepted them and then quietly buried them behind the temple wall under a fig tree. A small sign was later added, "Do not dig here. Contains weather-offensive legumes." This strange aversion didn't extend to all legumes, which is worth noting. Lentils were fine. Broad beans were debated, with alternating rulings depending on the moon phase. But chickpeas, always dangerous, especially when the clouds rolled in. At one point, the priests even constructed a small annex to the kitchen labeled Coquina Temporalist, the storm kitchen. It contained only bland, unseasoned ingredients deemed safe during volatile skies: boiled barley, toasted millet, room temperature beets, a jar of something labeled emergency figs. The emergency fig jar was never opened. No one remembered who had put it there. It was considered sacred by accident, but perhaps the most fascinating document to survive from this temple's long, uneventful history was a scroll now referred to by historians as the Thunder Scroll. Not because it roared or revealed hidden lightning techniques, but because it was filled entirely with weather notes and food reactions. Its contents included: avoided chickpeas. Result: minor stomach comfort. Praise: Fulgora. High winds. Consumed lentils with rosemary. felt uncertain. Recommend removing rosemary next time. Lightning in distance. Ate chickpeas by mistake. Experienced vivid dreams of olives. Possible divine rebuke. The scroll went on for 63 pages. Scholars have spent decades debating whether the content is serious theology or a sort of ancient food diary. But one thing is clear: the chickpea was not welcome during weather, and the priests stood by it. They didn't preach it in the streets. They didn't shout warnings from rooftops. They simply whispered among themselves, passed on recipes in hushed tones, and made very, very bland soup whenever the sky looked even slightly moody. Eventually, the temple of Fulgora faded from public memory. The big gods took center stage. New temples rose, and later, new religions entirely. The weather was still unpredictable, but no one blamed chickpeas anymore. Still, some say that on the quiet days, when thunder murmurs low and the sky smells faintly of ancient storm scrolls, the fig tree behind the old temple still grows a little crookedly, slightly away from where the chickpea cakes were buried. And it makes one wonder. In the years that followed the curious chickpea incidents, the priests of Fulgora quietly refined their weather-fast practices. What began as an odd, personal choice by a few cautious clerics evolved into an unofficial temple code unspoken, unenforced, yet universally respected. No chickpeas on cloudy days. No chickpeas when the wind spoke in spirals. And certainly no chickpeas when lightning had been heard within a half-day's walk. You may be imagining a large priesthood with robes, flapping dramatically, and rituals performed under tempestuous skies. But in truth, there were only about 5 of them. 6, if you counted Marcus, the doorkeeper, who wasn't officially ordained, but once had a dream about Fulgora whispering to him through a cracked clay lantern. The group functioned more like a monastic kitchen club than a powerful religious order. Their daily rhythm revolved around the weather and the meal calendar, which was meticulously updated with soft charcoal on an olive wood board near the pantry each morning. Before the day's tasks began, the head priest, usually a man named Decimus, known for his unwavering blandness, would stand beneath the open-air skylight of the temple's vestibule. He would hold up a small, shallow bronze bowl and study the sky through its reflection. This was known as the ceremony of the empty bowl. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud. It was mostly Decimus squinting. The belief was that if the sky appeared overly dramatic, if clouds swirled too quickly, or the blue seemed too sharp, then one must proceed with culinary caution. The bowl would then be placed upside down on a pedestal near the kitchen as a silent signal. Today is not a day for legumes of mischief. The other priests would nod solemnly and continue preparing the days. Acceptable offerings: mashed barley, paste, diluted honey water, maybe a thin soup with turnips if spirits were high. No one questioned this. The system worked. Storms came and went, and the priests remained unelectrocuted. That was enough for them. But one rainy spring, a new priest in training arrived, sent by the larger temple network in a sort of rotational assignment designed to spread liturgical consistency among minor cults. His name was Gaius Calvinus, and he was young, bright-eyed, and suspiciously enthusiastic. He brought with him scrolls from the Capitoline archives, 3 tunics embroidered with lightning motifs, and most troubling of all, a fondness for chickpeas, Fritters. At first, the elder priests welcomed him. He was helpful, polite, and very good at folding linens. But things began to sour when he suggested modernizing the kitchen. Fugora, he said one morning, does not want us to fear our ingredients. She wants us to thrive. He said this while aggressively whisking a bowl of chickpea batter. Others looked on in horror. Decimus dropped a spoon. The sky, of course, was cloudy that day. Not terribly so, just an ordinary overcast. But by temple custom, even a hint of cumulonimbus was enough to trigger a ban on suspicious pulses. Gaius insisted it was superstition. There's no divine mandate against legumes, he said. Only outdated habits and under-seasoned fears. Served the fritters anyway. Fried in oil, crisp on the edges with a dash of coriander. By all accounts, they were delicious. That afternoon, the statue of Fulgura in the back shrine was found with a faint crack running down its pedestal. Crack, shaped like a jagged bolt, was small but unmistakable. Rainwater had pooled at its base. No lightning had been heard, but no one spoke for several minutes. GAIUS offered several explanations involving drainage systems and marble fatigue. Decimus said nothing. He simply turned the ceremonial bowl upside down and placed it quietly on. The pedestal, no more fritters were made that week, but the debate had begun. The priests found themselves discussing things they hadn't questioned in decades. Was the chickpea rule truly sacred? Or had it become sacred only because they had treated it so? Was the Thunder Scroll divinely inspired, or merely the diary of a man with a very sensitive stomach? They read back through the scroll's entries. Many were vague. Some were oddly poetic. Storm behind the hills. Chickpeas avoided, slept well. Distant owl call, coincidence, uncertain. One night, unable to sleep, Marcus, the doorkeeper, shared a memory. Years ago, he had dreamed that the goddess Fulgora appeared not in lightning, but in steam rising from a bowl of plain lentils. She said nothing, just floated upward, soundless and serene. The priests agreed this felt important, though they weren't sure how. From that point on, the chickpea ban softened slightly. They didn't remove it outright, but they renamed it. It was no longer the storm legume prohibition, but instead called the gentle preference for less. Volatile pulses, it was still understood chickpeas were best saved for fair weather, but now exceptions could be made. One scroll was amended to read, "If the sky is confused, be plain. If the sky is clear, be bold. If unsure, ask the fig tree." That last part was added by Decimus, who had grown increasingly fond of sitting near the old fig tree where the senators' cakes had once been buried. He had started tying small messages to its branches, nothing grand, just notes like soft wind today, smells like parsley. Fulgora, do you mind coriander? Marcus snored during the soup again. The tree did not respond, but over time, a few figs did appear, small, wrinkled, and rather philosophical, looking. GAI-US eventually left the temple, assigned to a larger, noisier shrine near the forum before leaving. He gifted them a small tin of roasted chickpeas seasoned with rosemary and thyme. He called it contrition mix. DEC-IMU buried it near the fig tree with the others. The temple of Fulgora returned to its usual rhythm, bland soups, weather notes, silence, but now, occasionally, when clouds drifted overhead and thunder growled softly. In the distance, the priests would gather around a simmering pot and discuss whether the sky felt offended or merely opinionated. And it makes one wonder, the last few decades of the temple of Fulgora's quiet history were defined not by divine drama or thunderous proclamations, but by a slow, dependable routine that ancient Rome often forgot to remember in the city. Enamored with oratory, conquest, and massive columns, the temple of Fulgora remained an overlooked pocket of stillness. Its priests, now reduced to 3 official members and a very elderly Marcus, presided not over crowds, but over clouds. Their most reliable worshippers were sparrows, and yet the temple endured. It endured through administrative reforms. It endured through minor wars and the collapse of nearby bathhouses. It even endured through one calendar revision that accidentally scheduled the Feast of Atmospheric Inquiry during the rainy season 3 years in a row. This was mainly thanks to Decimus, who by now had become a revered figure in Rome's bureaucratic margins. He was known as the Storm Priest, though he had never called himself that. He had simply outlived 3 high priests of Jupiter, and once refused an invitation to dine with a provincial governor because the sky was in an uncooperative mood. In his final years, Decimus compiled what would become the temple's most extensive written legacy, the Lightning Ledger. The ledger was not a dramatic text. It was not poetic or prophetic. It was, in fact, a long, handwritten catalog of days, meals, cloud shapes, and possible correlations. Here's a sample entry. 11th of Sextilis, year 771 AUC, midday clouds, pale and wide. Smell of onions. Marcus dropped a ladle. Wind changed. Avoided chickpeas. Thunder heard later, possibly related. Soup, lentil, and fennel. Mildly received. Every page was like this studious, deeply observant, and curiously comforting. Nothing happened quickly in the ledger. Even lightning was reported with doubt. Flash scene, possibly reflection in brass bowl. Marcus unsure. Chickpeas not consumed. Better to err. Over time, the ledger became a sort of slow-motion theological text. Not because it revealed the will of the gods, but because it revealed the mind of a man who truly believed the weather, was speaking if only one listened carefully enough. By the time Decimus passed away peacefully, in his sleep, during a light drizzle, the temple was already being forgotten by the newer generation of Romans. The empire had shifted. Wanted bigger miracles, faster gods. Chickpeas had become fashionable again. The temple itself was repurposed twice. Once as a storage house for scrolls that didn't fit in the main library, and later as a garden annex for a senator who liked to sip wine while watching rain collect. On the old tiles, the last priest, an apprentice of Decimus named Servius, remained for a few more seasons. He wasn't particularly devout. He didn't mind chickpeas, but he had grown used to the quiet, and he liked the way the fig tree swayed during storms before leaving. He placed the lightning ledger in a dry clay jar and buried it near the tree, just beside the rusted tin of contrition mix. He said a few words, mostly improvised, and walked away without ceremony. That was the end of the Temple of Fulgora, except during one of the many architectural rearrangements of Rome, a worker repairing a collapsed wall near the old fig tree unearthed a peculiar jar. Inside was a thick, worn scroll covered in strange daily observations. At first, no one cared. It was considered nonsense, an eccentric shopping list perhaps, but one librarian, unusually fond of meteorology, decided to copy it. And then another scholar referenced it in a footnote. Over time, the lightning ledger began to appear in obscure studies of Roman agrarian superstition, religious ephemera, and early weather forecasting. By the 19th century, one British antiquarian described it as an astonishing early experiment in applied climatology disguised as dietary paranoia. A Swiss chef in the 1950s read about it and decided to honor the priests with a recipe called Fulgora's Caution, a bland lentil stew served with a single roasted chickpea on top, to symbolize temptation, watched but not swallowed. And even today, in a few quiet corners of certain weather-obsessed academic departments, you may find the occasional researcher referencing the Temple of Fulgora. When discussing how early civilizations interpreted storms, they might smile and mention the ceremony of the empty bowl, or the buried tin of spiced chickpeas, or the fig tree that may or may not have received divine correspondence. But most of all, they remember a small group of people who listened closely to the sky, ate carefully, and believed that caution itself was a kind of sacred ritual. And so we ask, the last few decades of the Temple of Fulgora's quiet history were defined not by divine drama or thunderous proclamations, but by a slow, dependable routine that ancient Rome often forgot to remember in a city enamored with oratory, conquest, and massive colony. The Temple of Fulgora remained an overlooked pocket of stillness. Its priests, now reduced to 3 official members and a very elderly Marquis, presided not over crowds, but over clouds. Their most reliable worshippers were sparrows. And yet, the temple endured. It endured through administrative reforms. It endured through minor wars and the collapse of nearby bathhouses. It even endured through one calendar revision that accidentally scheduled the Feast of Atmospheric Inquiry during the rainy season 3 years in a row. This was mainly thanks to Decimus, who by now had become a revered figure in Rome's bureaucratic margins. He was known as the Storm Priest, though he had never called himself that. He had simply outlived 3 high priests of Jupiter, and once refused an invitation to dine with a provincial governor because the sky was in an uncooperative mood. In his final years, Decimus compiled what would become the temple's most extensive written legacy, the Lightning Ledger. The ledger was not a dramatic text. It was not poetic or prophetic. It was, in fact, a long, handwritten catalog of days, meals, cloud shapes, and possible correlations. Here's a sample entry. 11th of Sextilis, year 771 AUC, midday clouds, pale and wide. Smell of onions. Marcus, dropped a ladle. Wind changed, avoided chickpeas. Thunder heard later, possibly related. Soup, lentil, and fennel. Mildly received. Every page was like this studious, deeply observant, and curiously comforting. Nothing happened quickly in the ledger. Even lightning was reported with doubt. Flash scene, possibly reflection in brass bowl. Marcus, unsure. Chickpeas, not concerned. Better to err. Over time, the ledger became a sort of slow-motion theological text. Not because it revealed the will of the gods, but because it revealed the mind of a man who truly believed the weather was speaking if only one listened carefully enough. By the time Decimus passed away peacefully, in his sleep, during a light drizzle, the temple was already being forgotten by the newer generation of Romans. The empire had shifted. Wanted bigger miracles, faster gods. Chickpeas had become fashionable again. The temple itself was repurposed twice. Once as a storage house for scrolls that didn't fit in the main library, and later as a garden annex for a senator who liked to sip wine while watching rain collect. On the old tiles, the last priest, an apprentice of Decimus named Servius, remained for a few more seasons. He wasn't particularly devout. He didn't mind chickpeas, but he had grown used to the quiet. And he liked the way the fig tree swayed during storms before leaving. He placed the lightning ledger in a dry clay jar and buried it near the tree, just beside the rusted tin of contrition mix. He said a few words, mostly improvised, and walked away without ceremony. That was the end of the temple of Fulgora, except during one of the many architectural rearrangements of Rome, a worker repairing a collapsed wall near the old fig tree unearthed a peculiar jar. Inside was a thick, worn scroll covered in strange daily observations. At first, no one cared. It was considered nonsense, an eccentric shopping list, perhaps, but one librarian, unusually fond of meteorology, decided to copy it. And then another scholar referenced it in a footnote. Over time, the lightning ledger began to appear in obscure studies of Roman agrarian superstition, religious ephemera, and early weather forecasting. By the 19th century, one British antiquarian described it as an astonishing early experiment in applied climatology disguised as dietary paranoia. A Swiss chef in the 1950s read about it and decided to honor the priests with a recipe called Fulgora's Caution, a bland lentil stew served with a single roasted chickpea on top to symbolize temptation, watched but not swallowed. And even today, in a few quiet corners of certain weather-obsessed academic departments, you may find the occasional researcher referencing the Temple of Fulgora. When discussing how early civilizations interpreted storms. They might smile and mention the ceremony of the empty bowl, or the buried tin of spiced chickpeas, or the fig tree that may or may not have received divine correspondence. But most of all, they remember a small group of people who listened closely to the sky, ate carefully, and believed that caution itself was a kind of sacred ritual. And so we ask, you might wonder how something as domestic and quiet as soup, something usually considered background noise in the grand opera of empires, could come to hold such importance. But in the Byzantine world, daily life operated on a rhythm of subtle observations, and when the official systems failed, people turned to what remained: the reliable, repetitive patterns of home. The grandmother's soup wasn't merely about food or superstition. It became an informal archive of weather wisdom handed down in recipes that never bothered to include exact measurements. Instead, they included phrases like boil until the steam smells like noon, add chickpeas when your knees ache, not before, or if the thyme wilts before touching water, take in the bedding rain comes tonight. These were not metaphors. They were instructions, and in many regions, they worked. Take, for example, the coastal town of Amazura, perched on the Black Sea, where sea mist often rolled in like a slow sigh and disappeared just as quietly. Here, older women maintained a tradition of morning broth readings. Every Thursday before market day, a grandmother would boil a broth using spring onions, lemon peel, and bay leaf. The trick was to place a sliver of silver, usually a dull coin, at the bottom of the pot. If the coin remained visible during the first boil, the next 2 days would be clear. If the coin vanished in the rolling bubbles, storms were imminent. Over time, this became part of civic routine. Market stalls were set up or cancelled based on the visibility of a single coin in soup. Boatmen chose their departure hour. Fishermen prepared their nets differently, and shoemakers, who hated rain's rolling leather, often visited the broth reader personally. The women who carried this knowledge rarely sought attention. Many of them were quiet, widowed, or simply unbothered by the political squabbles of the empire. Their loyalties were to the pot, the window, and the sky. There were even instances when local priests consulted them. While the church had its own calendar of feasts, fasts, and prayers for rain or calm, the practical matter of when to plant spring wheat or whether sheep needed to be moved, appeal depended far more on lentil thickness than on a saint's feast day. And then there was the phenomenon of mere soups. These were broths, boiled slowly until they created a perfect reflective surface like polished bronze. The tradition held that if you could see your own face clearly before the soup stirred itself, some believed soups could stir unprompted. If the weather was severe enough, then the next 3 days would be stable. If, however, the soup showed no reflection, if the surface rippled without cause or grew cloudy, then something was unsettled in the skies. The ingredients weren't exotic, bone stock, barley, herbs. But the care in preparation was meticulous. Everything mattered. The shape of the pot, the grain of the wooden spoon, the way the fire crackled, a split log indicated wind, and even the time of day. By the 10th century, weather soups had become part of what scholars today call the domestic climatology of Byzantium. In simple terms, it was the science of the everyday that Byzantine court, with its ceremonial calendars and astrological advisors, never officially endorsed soup eating. But it didn't dismiss it either. It simply ignored it, as empires often do, with quiet truths. Yet, tucked away in some letters and marginalia, we find subtle nods in a monastery record from Mount Athos. A monk scribbled between psalm verses, elder. Stamatia says her stew refused to thicken. We delay the grain shipment until skies prove themselves. In another, a ship manifest from Ephesus was adjusted at the last minute. The note reads, "Change in departure." The olive oil danced too high. Wait for cooler air. And in a surviving page from a merchant's ledger in the town of Pergamon, sold extra jars of thyme and sage. Storms, predicted by old Calliope's Brothshe, was right again. Flooded roads by evening. None of this would be accepted by today's meteorologists. But consider the context. In a time without barometers or satellites, the most consistent data source was a person who had spent 60 winters watching the same tree lose its leaves, the same fog creep in from the same sea, and the same pot of beans react slightly differently depending on the wind. These women, with their long memory and keen sense of smell, became living instruments. They noticed that the same soup that boiled in 15 minutes last week now took 22. That meant pressure had changed. That meant rain, or that thyme refused to stay fragrant after chopping early signal of dry air, or that a spoon left upright refuse to tip for minutes. High atmospheric stillness, possibly snow, and all of this they passed on, not with explanations, but through rituals. Never add lentils on the same day you trim the grapevines. Beans that split before boiling mean poor harvests. Garlic that floats brings visitors. Garlic that sinks brings storms. A modern mind might call this pattern recognition. A Byzantine grandmother would just say, "I have eyes." Interestingly, some of these traditions quietly survived long after the empire itself collapsed. In the villages of northern Greece, old women in the 19th century still whispered to pots. In parts of Anatolia, recipes were named not by flavor, but by forecast: clear sky stew, fog lentils, and storm-coming barley. Ethnographies traveling through rural Macedonia in the early 20th century recorded tales of kitchen days when no work outside was done because the soup sounded angry. Even today, in places like Ikaria or Mount Pelion, some families still speak of a grandmother or great-aunt who knew when to harvest simply by tasting the broth. And of course, there's always the question, why did it stop? Why did this quiet system, this parallel network of atmospheric sensing, rooted in kitchen and memory fade? Perhaps it was modernization. Thermometers replaced time. Weather reports replaced whispers. And cities replaced courtyards where the steam could be read without interference. But perhaps it wasn't that the method failed, only that we forgot how to listen, to steam, to onions, to the room itself. Because in truth, the Byzantine grandmother didn't just read the soup. She read the room, the way the air shifted around her knees, the way the flame flickered oddly to the right, the sound a bubbling pot made when a certain type of cloud hung above the olive trees. This was data gathered over decades, held in memory and stirred gently into something warm and edible. And even as the empire bent under wars, theology, and politics, these women forecasted what mattered to those who lived quiet lives: when to stay in, when to travel, when to hang laundry or salt fish. All of it recorded not in scrolls or marble, but so when we study Byzantium, it may be worth asking not just what the emperors declared, but what the soup was doing that morning. By the end of the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire had grown thin at the edges. Its cities were no longer bursting with scholars, its borders no longer firm, and its treasure, like the once overflowing olive jars in seaside homes, had mostly dried out. And yet, in quiet kitchens, the broth still bubbled, not because the emperors had commanded it, or because the monasteries had preserved it, but because grandmothers kept their routines. Even as the empire shrank, the weather still came, and someone had to predict it. The sky didn't stop moving just because the court had run out of corns. In the mountain village of Aroia, an elderly woman named Despina was known for one thing: her soup kettle never cooled. Her family had long since scattered, and most of the village's men had left for Constantinople or vanished into various skirmishes. But Despina remained. She was said to speak to her pot before dawn, leaning in and whispering small questions to it as though the water held answers. When asked why she did this, she replied, "The pot remembers what I forget. Together, we still know. Despina's soup was not for selling or feasting. It was for watching. She observed how the steam curled around the doorframe, how the onions behaved when sliced. She kept track on a wall marked with soft scratches of how long it took for a barley broth to boil on days when the clouds hung lower than the rooftops, her neighbors. Though few would still ask, Despina, are we expecting rain? Despina, will the snow hold till Sunday? Is it a lentil day or a bean day? She rarely gave direct answers. Instead, she might hand them a sprig of dry rosemary or wave her spoon in the air like a weather vane. It wasn't always clear what she meant, but it was always clear that she meant something. One afternoon, in the final years before the empire's fall, a wandering scholar passed through Veroia. He had come from Thessaloniki, where he'd grown tired of monastery disputes over scroll ownership. He'd heard of Despina from a wine merchant who swore she once predicted hail simply by smelling boiled cabbage. Naturally skeptical, the scholar asked if he could interview her. Despina invited him in, placed a bowl of carrot soup in front of him, and said, "Ask your questions, but listen to the pot more than to me." And so he did for 3 days. He sat in Despina's kitchen and recorded everything he saw, not just what she said, but how she moved, how she chose ingredients with her fingertips, how she listened for subtle changes in the sound of boiling, how she seemed to know what time it was simply by the shift in flavor of a slowly thickening broth. The scholar's notes survive. They're kept in a dusty archive in Athens, rarely read and often misfired under folk belief. Domestic. Here's one entry. Tuesday, before dawn. Despina sliced an onion and stared at the pieces. She murmured something about short tears and long wind, refused to explain. Soup was unusually salty. Wind picked up by evening. Another, water, refused to boil despite full fire. Despina said, the skies holding its breath. Rain arrived at midnight in one final entry, dated weeks later and seemingly added after leaving the village. The scholar writes, she is not a scientist. She is not a magician. She is a woman who has seen 50 Aprils and knows that soup never lies. Despina's story ends quietly. She passed one autumn peacefully while a barley and thyme broth simmered on her hearth. No one replaced her. The village eventually dwindled. The house collapsed in a storm 2 decades later. But there's a small stone near where her kitchen stood, carved crudely with a ladle and a sprig of bay. It's not an official monument, just something someone made. Perhaps a neighbor who once avoided laundry because she'd smelled leaks. in the steam. And so, the practice of soup watching, of storm reading through broth, began to fade as the Ottomans rose and the final scraps of Byzantium were absorbed. New sciences arrived, new calendars, new explanations. Whether prediction became formal, charted, spoken in numbers instead of flavors. Yet, even today, a trace remains. There are Greek fishermen who will still say, "The pot didn't boil right this morning," and "Stay on shore." There are Cypriot grandmothers who claim you can feel humidity in your wrists, but also in your rice. There are old recipes titled "Cloudy Day Soup" with no explanation as to why the name fits only that it does. Modern science can't explain why parsley wilts differently before a thunderstorm, but grandmothers once could, not with data, but with noticing. And they passed it on with a spoon, not a scroll. So when you next make supeshali on a windy day, take a moment to listen to the steam. Watch how it curls, smell the broth, and see what it tells you, because maybe the soup does remember. Maybe the pot does know. And maybe, just maybe, we forgot how to ask the right questions. Before there were asphalt roads, digital maps, or the thump of rubber tires on driveways, there were bells, small ones, tinny and uneven, sewn onto caps with thread that frayed in the sun and froze in the snow. They jingled softly, not like a celebration, but more like a warning or a reassurance, depending on who you were. In the thick forests and muddy cart paths of colonial America, the postman was often the only consistent visitor to some settlements. He came alone, on foot or on horseback, bundled in wool that smelled of wood smoke and wet leather. But most important of all, he wore a bell. Why? The official answer never quite matched the real one in the colonial government records of Massachusetts, Bay, and Virginia. The bells were categorized under signal tools. Their purpose to alert recipients to the approach of the postman, so they could prepare for delivery or pay any due postage upon arrival. But that was only part of the truth. The real reason for the bells had less to do with logistics and more to do with fear. The early American colonies were not yet fully carved from the wilderness. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, the roads were paths, the bridges were often missing, and the woods were vast, filled not only with animals and hidden creeks, but also with uncertainty for isolated communities. Hearing the faint jingle of a postman's bell was sometimes the only sound that pierced a week of silence. It was proof that the outside world still existed, that someone remembered them. And for the postman, the bell was protection. It warned travelers around bends that someone was coming, helpful on narrow trails, where two riders might otherwise collide. It startled bears and wild dogs, tame. Most importantly, it told wary settlers, I am not a threat. Some postmen attach a single bell to their walking stick. Others wore a line of them stitched along the hem of their coats. But the most iconic look, preserved in folk paintings and letters, was the bell hacha, simple felt cap with a loop of copper bells stitched around the crown. It made the postman look faintly ridiculous, like a traveling jester. But it made him safe dot in the village of Deerfield, Massachusetts. One particular postman became known as Ringing Rob. His real name was Robert Haskins, a former apprentice cobbler turned government courier after an accident left him with a limp and no desire to sit in a shop all day. Rob was tall, thin, and so constantly covered in dust that local children swore he blended into the road like a ghost made of dirt. But he had a cheerful habit before entering a new hamlet. He would spin in place 3 times, letting the bells on his hat chime wildly. He said it woke up the road. Whether he meant the people, the trees, or something more superstitious, he never explained. Rob's rounds took him deep into the Berkshire Hills and across poorly marked terrain. He carried letters, receipts, tax records, and, on one memorable occasion, a box of pickled eggs wrapped in velvet and marked urgent. The reason was never recorded, but it wasn't just what he carried that made him known. It was how he moved. Every few miles, Rob would stop, kneel, and ring his hat bells intentionally slowly and in a pattern. 1 ring, pause, 2 quick jingles. Locals came to recognize it as his signal. The pattern traveled ahead of him, echoing through the trees. Mothers told their children, listen for Rob's jingle. That's how we know it's Thursday. Even during winter, when snow softened the trails and silence sat heavy over the land, his bells marked the passage of time. One settler in western Connecticut wrote in her journal, he came this day, bells, faint under snow, sounded like hope with frost on it. But the bells were not always cheerful. One spring, when rumors of conflict with local militias swirled and mail routes were unsafe, Rob's bells stopped. For nearly 6 weeks, there was nothing. In the absence of the sound, people began to worry. They listened more carefully to the wind, imagining phantom jingles in the rustle of pine needles. Then, on a clear April morning, a faint jingle echoed through a mountain pass. Children ran outside. Dogs barked. The miller's wife dropped an entire basket of flour from excitement. It was not Rob. It was another postman. James Elder, who had taken over Rob's route while the latter recovered from frostbite. But James didn't wear Rob's hat. His bells rang a little too fast, a little too high. The villagers noticed the difference that day. James was given Rob's old walking stick, which had a small bell tied just beneath the handle with faded blue thread. The village blacksmith insisted he use it, saying, "The road remembers, Rob. It'll forget you if you don't speak its language." It's unclear whether James believed in such things, but he carried the stick from then on. The use of bells among American postmen began to wane by the mid-1700s. As settlements grew and roads improved, the need for such signaling devices faded. The bells were considered quaint, even distracting. A reform in 1763 suggested mailmen wear standardized uniforms and discouraged any unofficial adornments or sounds. Bells were among the first casualties of regulation, but many rural carriers quietly resisted. They kept small bells hidden in coat pockets or tied under their sleeves. One even sewed a single brass bell inside his tricorn hat, where it would ring softly only when he bowed. Some called it stubbornness. Others called it ritual. By 1781, the bell-wearing postman was more memory than presence. But stories remained. Letters from the Revolutionary period mentioned bells being heard just before a rider arrived. Some attribute them to horses. Others swear they were from the hat of a stubborn courier who refused to modernize. A diary from Vermont includes this note. Today the letter came, and with it a memory. I thought I heard bells faint, and from long ago. By the time colonial America's post roads were mapped with any regularity, the sound of a bell had already carved itself into the daily lives of thousands. Long before newspapers became daily habits and well-linked schedules marked delivery. Days, it was the rhythm of bells soft and unhurried that told people something is arriving. Someone is coming. But beyond the practical and the superstitious, the bell became something stranger, kind of informal passport. The colonies, after all, were not unified in much during the early 1700s. Even within regions, there were rivalries between towns, suspicion of outsiders, and varied customs for who was allowed through a gate, into a yard, or across a bridge dot. So, when a postman walked the trail with a cap of jingling bells, he was signaling more than presence. He was asking for permission to pass the gate that only opened to sound take. For example, the small township of New Nether Hollow, tucked away in the shadow of the Appalachian foothills, settled by a mixture of Dutch and English families. It was known for its clannish habits and impressive hedgerows. For decades, it had only one road in a wooden gate that stayed shut at all times except Sunday morning, unless, of course, the postman rang his bells in the right rhythm. 3 short jingles, a pause, then one long jingle, like a yawn. It sounds ridiculous now, but the villagers insisted it was tradition. They said it was safer that way, a way to hear intentions. Even local children were trained to recognize the male rhythm. And once, when a sheep startled and rang the exact pattern by chance, thanks to a decorative bell on its collar, several villagers came to the gate expecting letters and were bitterly disappointed. Eventually, they wrote the postmaster a formal request: please, for the sake of sanity and custom, do not allow postmen without hats equipped with functional bells. We are not used to being surprised by silence. The bells that measure distance in the Chesapeake region, where waterways snaked through thick groves and settlements were scattered like crumbs, bells took on another function. They became the map. There were no street signs in the dense woods, and for couriers on foot or horseback, the only way to know how close they were to a homestead was by listening to the echo of their own bells. Well-trained postmen knew the difference between how bells rang in open fields versus tight pine stands. A faint double echo meant he was near the river bend. A muffled jingle told him he was too close to the bogs. And if the bell's sound vanished entirely, he was probably surrounded by heavy laurel, too dense for sound to travel. 1. Maryland, Korea. Thomas Yardley kept a crude bell log stitched inside the lining of his coat. It wasn't a map in the traditional sense. It was more like a poem of echoes got at 7 jingles north from the big sycamore. The bell sounds flat, turn east. After 2 chimes more, a dog will bark and a widow will ask you to stay for tea. It was part directions, part memory. It worked for him, an odd friendship between bell and dog. The postman's bell also became a cue for animals. Dogs, especially, learned to associate the sound with particular behavior, barking, guarding, or, in some cases, greeting in one Pennsylvania town. A dog named Elmo Hoff Mastiff, Hoff Mystery, was known to react with perfect predictability. When he heard bells approaching, he would sit by the front porch and wait, ears pricked and tail absolutely still. When the bells got close enough, he would wag once, only once, and then lie down. It wasn't trained behavior. It was routine. And for years, Elmo became a sort of living doorbell for the postman. He never barked at Rob Haskins or his successors, just waited, wagged, then napped when Elmo passed away at what was said to be the dignified age of 14. The village blacksmith made a tiny brass bell with Elmo's name etched into it. He tied it to the inside of his coat pocket and never walked without it. Bells, as memory, there is something deeply human about turning sound into memory. Think of the chime of a clock tower, or the call to prayer, or the clatter of hooves on cobbled stone in colonial America, where so much was uncertain: weather, crops, wars. Taxes the bell on the postman's hat was one of the few consistent, predictable sounds. It was often the only mechanical rhythm in a world of natural chaos. Children were born listening to it. Grandparents passed away with it echoing down the lane. It marked the delivery of war notices, love letters, birth announcements, and death. Reminders, even in their most mundane form. The bells carried news of the world beyond the fields, which is why, when bells disappeared from the postman's uniform, it wasn't just a bureaucratic shift. It felt like a loss of connection, a silencing of something important, if unspoken. A woman in Albany wrote in 1784, "The letters arrive still, but the world no longer announces itself before it arrives." The silence is efficient, but colder. I miss the bells, the disappearance of the bells by the time of the American Revolution. The post service was being reorganized into something more official, more secure. Speed and secrecy became the goal, especially when transporting war intelligence or tax documents. Bells were seen as too obvious in some areas. Bells were even outlawed for military couriers. But the bell tradition didn't vanish instantly. It dwindled slowly. An 1801 journal entry by a former postman read, "Walked my final route today without the cap. The wind was still. The trees watched me. I felt like a trespasser in my own rhythm." It was a quiet farewell to a strange, long-standing tradition, one that had outlived its utility, but not its soul. A final anecdote. The lost bell, perhaps the best example of how the bells lingered in memory, comes from a story passed down in the hill country of New Hampshire. It tells of an old man, nobody remembers his name, who had once served as a bell-wearing postman in his final years. Half blind and mostly deaf, he lived alone in a weather-beaten house, surrounded by overgrown trails. But once a week, usually on Thursdays, he would walk the same circuit he had walked 50 years earlier, no mail in hand, no official duty, just memory. He wore his bell hat. By then, the bells were rusty and out of tune, but they still rang, faint and hollow. Children used to follow him quietly through the woods, pretending he was the ghost of the old post road. Some swore they heard the bells even when he wasn't there. Eventually, the man passed away. His hat was placed on a wooden peg by the fireplace. The bells never rang again until one stormy night, years later, when a traveler took shelter in the house now abandoned and swore he heard soft chiming in the middle of the night, circling the front room in a slow, careful rhythm. He left before dawn. When he returned a week later with friends to investigate, the hat was still there, but one bell had fallen to the floor. It wasn't rusted, and it was warm to the touch. By the time the 19th century opened its eyes to steamships and telegraphs, the humble, bell-hatted postman had already begun his quiet fade into folklore. It happened so gradually, so politely, that few even noticed. But those who had grown up with the sound, that soft, distinctive chime dancing just ahead of the letter's arrival, found themselves reaching for a world that no longer rang. The bells, once symbols of rhythm and reassurance, had become ghosts of a system that no longer had time for noise. The bureaucracy of silence when the United States Postal Service began its formal structuring in the early 1800s. The days of personalized walking routes, jingle-mapped trails, and postmen who took tea with elderly widows were deemed inefficient. Now, the emphasis was on timed routes, standard uniforms, and, above all, discretion. Gone were the bells, the decorated caps, the slow, familiar footsteps on dusty roads. In their place came sealed wagons, strict timetables, and eventually stagecoaches and trains. It made perfect sense, of course. Faster delivery, more reach, greater volume. But progress has a way of trimming away the very idiosyncrasies that made systems human. The postman no longer needed to be recognized. He had a badge. He no longer needed to ring a bell. The schedule spoke for him. He no longer needed to be trusted. He was official. What remained in the dust still? In corners of the country where time moved, slowly valleys tucked behind mountain, passes, islands with irregular ferry routes, towns that hadn't yet adopted gas lamps. The old ways lingered like perfume on a wool coat. Some retired postmen passed their bells on to their sons, not as tools, but as keepsakes. In one Connecticut village, a widow refused to open her door to any courier who didn't carry a bell, even if he wore the modern badge. "If I can't hear you coming," she said, "then the news you bring doesn't belong to me." Elsewhere, a tavern in Rhode Island kept a bell hat above its fireplace. Patrons were invited to ring it gently if they wanted to leave a message or a letter behind. It was tradition. No one really remembered why. The bell, by then, had become a symbol of truster, kind of gentle, pact between the sender and the receiver. A reminder that someone had walked miles just to place a folded piece of paper in your hand, and that used to mean something. Bells in wartime, curiously. The bell saw a quiet revival during wartime, not for communication, but for deception during the War of 1812 and later during the Civil War. Couriers sometimes used decoy bell jingles in wooded areas to distract or confuse enemies. A Union scout once tied 6 brass buttons to a string and mimicked the colonial bell pattern while leading a squad through enemy territory. Soldiers later reported hearing what they assumed was an old postman, gone, lost. They didn't pursue in that moment. The sound of the postman's bell, once a symbol of connection, had become a cloak of misdirection, a sonic relic that still held power, even if its purpose had shifted. Letters remembered the sound bears, a strange phenomenon in oral histories from the 1800s, particularly in towns that were settled long before independence. When describing the arrival of important letters, those announcing deaths, marriages, new land deeds, or payments, long-awaited people often recall the moment not just with visual memory, but auditory. They say things like, "I remember hearing him before I saw him." The bells stopped just as I opened the door. It wasn't the letter that brought tears. It was the way the sound ended, which suggests something remarkable. The sound of the bell wasn't just a delivery notice. It was an emotional primer. It prepared the heart for whatever news would follow. The bell makers. Last order, one little-known figure in this story is a man named Ezra Winthrop, a bellsmith who lived in Boston between 1749 and 1825. His shop made over 1,000 small brass bells, no larger than a coin design, specifically to be sewn into postman's hats and belts. Ezra was proud of his work. He tuned every bell by hand, gave them nicknames. He claimed each bell had a personality and would only chime properly for the rite. Postman, his ledgers are filled with notes like bell number 412, timid but true, best for a younger courier. Bell number 897, too loud for wooded roots, perfect. For coastal fog, bell number 1000, the last one, may it find a kind wearer. That final bell, number 1000, was never sold. It stayed on Ezra's desk until his death, and when his belongings were auctioned, a child bought it for a single penny. She used it to call her cat home for dinner. And so, one of the last bells made for the American postal path became a dinner chimate's journey, complete in a perfectly ordinary way, the return of the bell, sort of, in recent years. A few historical towns and reenactment villages have brought back the bell tradition, not out of necessity, but nostalgia. In Deerfield, Massachusetts, in replica uniforms deliver handwritten notes through the town while wearing Belladin caps. Children race to hear the sound first. Elders sit on their porches, eyes half closed, waiting for the jingle they remember from stories told in kitchens long ago. It's not functional anymore, but that's not the point. The bell has returned as a symbol of patience, of walking, not rushing, of hearing before reading, and perhaps most importantly, of being expected, the legacy in modern quieted day. We receive our messages in silence. Emails slide in noiselessly. Notifications ping, but only because we program them to. The messenger no longer approaches on foot. The letter no longer waits in a bag warmed by a man's coat. The bell no longer jingles against a blue sky, but somewhere in the deep woods of memory, or perhaps in an old box of trinkets at an antique shop, there's still a soft ring echoing, not loud, not important, just persistent. And if you ever hear it on a foggy morning and the air feels oddly familiar, don't be alarmed. It might just be the road remembering.